Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Beyond Never Again, our 6-week journey exploring how the Holocaust speaks to us today. Today we are going to be doing lesson 6, which is lesson 4. I'm sorry, I don't know why I said lesson 6. Lesson 4. You see, I said lesson 6. On the screen it says lesson 3, but in reality it's lesson 4. Trust me, it's lesson 4. Lesson 4, which is titled, Out of the Depths I Call to You. So this slide is wrong, which I'll have to check. I'll have to check that. But you should know you're in the right lesson.
I'm on the right page.
You're on the right page, yeah. Okay. So it's titled Out of the Depths I Call to You, and we're going to be talking about finding faith in difficult times. Today's lesson is generously sponsored by an anonymous sponsor. I want to thank them very much. The Schus soll sie beistehen, as they say in Yiddish. The merit should stand by them. The plan for today, for lesson 4, is to basically make a 3-step process. We're going to talk about how faith helps Jews in times of crisis, how faith helps guide Jews in times of suffering. And we're going to do so, first of all, by examining what I call the search for meaning. In other words, understanding that when we have pain in our lives, searching for meaning in that pain is a good thing. I'll talk more about that. I know it sounds very cryptic right now and maybe even a little bit offensive, but we'll talk about that in a moment. And then we're going to talk about living with faith. What exactly means live with faith? How we develop faith that can then take us through crises. And finally, as usual, we are going to take it and apply it to the Holocaust. So, as a reminder, in our course here, we've been really trying very hard not to treat the Holocaust as a statistic. Rather, when we discuss this in lesson 1 and lesson 2, etc., rather take each story to appreciate that each person's the loss of one life, the loss of one, the tragedy of one person's story is an enormous Holocaust in and of itself, and then to multiply it 6 million times like that, we really grasp it. And the way we do that is by exploring that life. So, for example, today, when we're going to talk about exploring how faith plays a role in coping and even finding meaning in pain and in suffering, we're going to do that by exploring individual people's lives. And then we can apply that to the macro, etc. So that's kind of the plan for today. We're going to open with some key questions. All right? Again, starting off completely unrelated to the Holocaust, and then at the end of the lesson, we'll apply it. Number 1 is, how did Jews throughout the ages remain hopeful despite hardships? The Holocaust is far from the first hardship to occur to any Jew. It may have been the largest in number. It may have been even the most grotesque in its savagery. And in its evil, but Jews always had to figure out a way to cope in difficult times, even if they were economical difficult times. And specifically, what did they find within their tradition, within their faith that sustained them? What exactly was it within Judaism that sustained them? And then finally, we'll be able to apply that to how did Jews under Nazi control maintain emunah, maintain faith, as they stood at the edge of the abyss, where all faith seems to be challenged. Okay. We're going to open with a conversation about the search for meaning. And I'd like to start, Mark, by asking you to read for us. We're on page 96 in the textbook. I ask you to read for us, please, text 1. It should be very, very familiar to many of you. There are a few Psalms that kind of people end up reading all the time. This one in particular is from Psalm 22. And King David is obviously in a very challenging place. And I'd like to open with that. Go ahead.
Song of David. My God, why have you forsaken me? You are far from my salvation and from the words of a Maimoni. My God, I call out by day and you do not reply, and at night I do not keep silent.
Okay. In other words, King David is asking a few questions of us. He's asking us, he's not asking us. When we look at King David's response here to his suffering in his life, which God knows that he suffered quite a bit, we see 2 things. First of all, clearly King David feels abandoned. He actually says it. My God, why have you forsaken me? And yet at the same time, he calls God his salvation, right? But he says, I call out to you all day and you do not reply. So there's this paradox here where he's calling out to God, and yet at the same time, he feels abandoned by God. Which leads us to ask another very important question. But before I ask the second important question, I want to make a very, very important, not disclaimer, but qualification before we dive into today's topic. I made the qualification at the beginning of lesson 1, and I'm going to make the qualification again now. This lesson is not about theodicy. This lesson is not about answering the question why evil exists in the world. That's a question that we can answer when, or that we can attempt to answer when we talk about the evils that are in the world, etc. In other words, in lesson 1, we dealt with this question. Why did the Holocaust happen? Where was God in the Holocaust, etc.? And we ultimately came to the conclusion that it's not a question that can be answered, but that's one way of approaching it. In lesson 4, we're asking a different question. We're asking, now that a tragedy is going on, without understanding why it's going on, how do we deal with it? And this is what leads me to my second question from King David. He's living in this paradox, right? How can we apply that to our lives? How would you comfort a person who is suffering? Would you speak to his heart or to his mind? When you look at King David, you seem to see a splitting of the two. In his mind, he seems to be very much still believing in God. But emotionally, he feels like God has forsaken him. He feels abandoned by God. And that's what we want to talk about today. We want to understand, sure, I believe in God in theory. Like, if you sit me down for a philosophy class, you ask me, do I believe in God? How do I believe the world came about? I'll tell you, yeah, sure, God created the world. Do I believe we should serve God? Of course I believe we should serve God. Do I believe that everything comes from God? Great. But then the fact is that I'm suffering right now. It reminds me of the story. There's a story of a rabbi who was very much a beloved rabbi and teacher, but he was able to teach without asking for a salary. And the reason he didn't have to ask for a salary is because his family was in the timber business. They'd buy logs from abroad and they'd bring them back to their country and sell locally, etc., etc. And by dint of this luxury, he was able to serve the community, but he didn't have to take a salary, he didn't have to ask for anything in return. He just served the community with a full heart. And then one day tragedy struck, and there was a report that came to the city, and the rabbi was not the first to hear about it, that the ship that was carrying logs was lost at sea and the family fortune was lost. So when the news reached the town, nobody wanted to tell the rabbi the news. How do you break this kind of news to the rabbi that he'd have to go either he'll have to ask for a salary or he'll have to go out and get a different job, and that his whole life is ruined. So they weren't sure what to do. And they brought the job before, obviously, it came before the head of the community council. The head of the community council wasn't sure what to do. And so he finally decides, you know what, I'm going to go to the rabbi's most beloved student. His closest student who used to study for him all the time. He says to him, you know what, it's your job. You have officially been given the job. You have to tell the rabbi about this loss. And so the student says, I have an idea. He says, I'm going to break the news to him. He comes over to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, I have a question. There's a quote in the Talmud, in Tractate Brachot, which says, Kishem shemevarchin ala tov, kach mevarchin ala ra. That just as one makes a blessing for when something good happens to them, thank you Hashem for doing this good, thank you Hashem for allowing me to marry off my daughter, thank you Hashem for giving me this good fortune, whatever it is, right? So too shall you bless for the bad. So he comes to the rabbi, says, Rabbi, I have a question. I don't understand this piece of Talmud. I don't understand this quote from the Talmud. I should dance. It's one thing if I experience a tragedy, I shouldn't complain to God, or I should accept it, or I should believe that there's a higher purpose. But I should dance. I should accept it. I should bless for it. I should thank for it the same way that I do for a blessing. Something doesn't add up. So the rabbi says, no, this is how it goes. He says, this is what it works. No pain, no gain. There's a higher purpose in everything, and you gotta understand. And the rabbi starts giving a whole lengthy explanation. He says, Rabbi, you literally mean that I should get up and dance? If somebody suffers a tremendous loss, they should get up and they should dance and they should be excited about this tremendous loss? So the rabbi says, yes, they should. I don't understand what you don't understand about the Talmud. That's how it works. No pain, no gain. There's a higher purpose in everything. Hashem has a plan, and therefore you should dance when something terrible is done to you. The student takes a dramatic pause. He looks at the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, you better start dancing. And the rabbi listens to what he says, and he falls into a faint on the floor. When they rouse the rabbi looks at the student goes, I don't understand, why'd you faint? He says, because I realize all of a sudden I don't understand this passage in the Talmud at all. I don't know if this story ever happened, but it's a good story to illustrate the tremendous chasm, the tremendous distance that there is between understanding something mentally and applying it emotionally. Between knowing that something is true or actually being able to live that way. And when it comes to dealing with tragedy, when it comes to appreciating a higher purpose in it, when it comes to applying basically our faith in times of crisis, that's often when people are like, oh, all of a sudden I don't understand it at all. And this is when I want to make a big introduction to this lesson. Everything that we are going to discuss in today's lesson is going to be told in the first person. What do I mean by the first person? We might sometimes talk in the second person, but when you talk to yourself, these are the words you have to tell yourself. The only person that can tell somebody a way that they can manage their tragedy is only the person to themselves. We can study it here all cool, calm, and collectively, sober as I like to call it, right now, hopefully we're not suffering through tragedy. Or at least that's not the topic on the table. We're discussing it, as they say in Yiddish, in Inyan, in theory. But then applying it has to be done a person to himself. There are some things that to be able to tell them to someone else is not the right place. Is not the right place to do them. Meaning, when you discuss someone else's suffering, as we've spoken about in previous lessons, you have to have tremendous empathy for them. And it's not the time to start explaining it. It's not the time to start giving them coping mechanisms. You don't have to solve their issues. You just have to listen, and you have to be there for them because they're in a place of tremendous suffering. Which is why the main topic under discussion here is, when we are going through difficult times, what can we tell ourselves? How does faith play a role in us navigating these challenges? Jewish tradition, it turns out, provides a variety of ways of doing this, and and at the risk of I guess not at any risk. Before I begin, I want to take a moment to talk about what Judaism does not say. There are often common reactions to difficulties in a person's life, where a person will say things. Obviously, they say, "Why me?" Right? Why did God do this to me? But often the question is not even asked as in, why did God do this to me, or why is this happening to me, etc. The question is asked with a slightly different angle to it. What did I do to deserve this? Why do I deserve this? And that is a completely different question, because that question builds on an assumption where people basically look at it that there must be something in my life that I did wrong, that's why God would make this happen to me. And that is 100% not the Jewish approach. There are times in Judaism, meaning it makes sense that people take this approach. It's natural for human beings to seek meaning within everything. It's natural for human beings to say to themselves, God is a fear God, and what if He's giving it to me, it means I deserve it, and I just have to look at myself and figure out why I deserve it. That is a natural reaction, because as human beings, we like to tell ourselves stories. We like for things to add up. We like for things to make sense. However, while there are times in Judaism when that is said, the most notable one that I can think of is with Pharaoh. When Pharaoh loses his freedom of choice and God is hardening his heart and bringing him all the plagues, etc. Judaism does take the approach that God punished him mida keneged mida, measure for measure. He did something, therefore he deserved this punishment. But that is not a blanket rule at all. Judaism does not, in any location, in any part of our literature, even if it says that sometimes a negative occurrence in a person's life is a punishment or a wake-up call or whatever it is for something negative that they did in the past, or sometimes it's a wake-up call to do something positive, that is always qualified by the word sometimes. It's never the blanket reason, the reason that a person is suffering. In other words, Judaism does not take the approach that if somebody is suffering, it means that there's necessarily something that they're supposed to be fixing. So that's the first thing I want to say. Having said that, I now want to introduce you to a few different ideas that exist within Jewish literature that are quote-unquote coping mechanisms for dealing with crisis, that are ways in which our faith can play a role in navigating difficult and challenging and painful and painful situations of suffering. The first one is, the first most important insight that Judaism always reminds us is to remember the big picture. People, human beings, like to think that what they see is what they get. In other words, we like to immediately ascribe meaning to an occurrence. I was in a car accident, it's bad. I won the lottery, it's good. Something happened to me, it's bad, it's good, it's bad, it's good, etc. And we often tend to do that either in the micro, in other words, a small moment, a small sliver, we say this is either a good thing or a bad thing. Or we like to do that even in what we consider the big picture, such as my whole life and everything that happens in my life. When really, if you think about it, the amount of years that a person spends alive on this earth are really such a small portion. And their experience is such a small portion compared to all the other 8 billion people who live on the planet. And their experiences. In other words, the first piece of advice that Judaism gives us is zoom out and appreciate that you only have a tiny little perspective, whereas God has a larger picture. I'm reminded of the children's book. There's a children's book called Fortunately. And as usual, children's books have they often have very, very powerful messages. So let me go through this book with you, all right? We're not going to go through all the pictures and everything, but we'll go through basically the text as it goes through line by line. You ready? The book starts off as follows. Fortunately, one day, Ned got a letter that said, please come to a surprise party. Unfortunately, the party was in Florida. He was in New York. Fortunately, his friend loaned him an airplane. Unfortunately, the motor exploded. Fortunately, there was a parachute on the airplane. Anybody see where this is going? Unfortunately, there was a hole in a parachute. Fortunately, there was a haystack on the ground. Unfortunately, there was a pitchfork in the haystack. Fortunately, he missed the pitchfork. Unfortunately, he missed the haystack. Fortunately, he landed in water. Unfortunately, there were sharks in the water. Fortunately, he could swim. Unfortunately, there were tigers on the land. Fortunately, he could run. Unfortunately, he ran into a deep, dark cave. Fortunately, he could dig. Unfortunately, he dug himself into a fancy ballroom. Fortunately, there was a surprise party going on. And fortunately, the party was for him. Because fortunately, it was his birthday. The point that I'm trying to make with this children's book, which makes it in such a whimsical way, is really a deep point that is illustrated in the Talmud. In the Talmud, a story is told about Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi was a Talmudic sage who always wanted to ride. He always wanted to spend time with Elijah the prophet. Elijah the prophet, we are told that if someone merits, they study enough and they pray enough, etc., Elijah the prophet will appear to them and he will tell them secrets from the Torah, etc. And he always wanted to experience this with Elijah the prophet. And I'm not really going to go through the whole story, but basically it goes very similar to this children's book. One night, Elijah the prophet tells him, he reveals himself to him. Eventually, he reached a stage where Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi had an ongoing relationship with Elijah the prophet. And he was able to ask him questions, and he had like an open communication with him. And one night, Elijah the prophet, he asks Elijah the prophet, he says, I want to go with you. I know you have all sorts of missions that God sent you on in this world, things to do. I want to go with you. I want to travel with you to see all the things that happen. And Elijah the prophet basically tells him, you can travel with me as long as you don't ask any questions. The moment you start asking questions, that'll be the end of it, and you'll never be able to travel alone. You have to basically accept everything I do with blind faith. And the details of the story, without getting into the details of the story, he travels with him from home to home, from city to city, from situation to situation, when Elijah the prophet keeps making things happen that seem terrible. And each time he asks Elijah the prophet tells him, remember what I said. If you ask questions, you're not going to be able to. And eventually he asks enough questions, and Elijah the prophet tells him, listen, you asked so many questions, I'm happy to answer them for you, but then that's the end of it. Then there's no more writing with me, you know the deal. And eventually he answers all of his questions one by one in a very similar manner to the way this children's book does it. Fortunately, unfortunately, when this happened, and it seemed terrible, really it was a good thing for this person, etc. Each one at a time. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi understood that there was much more to the story than perhaps met the eye. And we can do this in our own lives. On page 98, we have an exercise. Okay? The exercise basically asks you to pretend that there is a trip to Paris available as a prize for those who score highest on a school French exam. The examination is going to have 4 parts, and there are 4 books available for study, one for each part. For the purpose of this example, everybody on this Zoom should pretend, or watching this video, should pretend that you want the prize and would love to visit Paris. Okay? And here's what happens. You go through a series of issues. What happens? First, there's an event, right? And this is basically where you have to circle as you go along. There's an event that happens. Number one, the bookstore is out of book 3, and the other students refuse to let you see or study from their book. What's the short-term meaning of the event? When you hear you're frustrated at the people, you're upset. Why won't they let me the book? Why is the store out of the book? Right? I want to be able to go through it. So it's bad. And then it goes through example after example after example after example. You oversleep, and you missed a flight, and your taxi is stuck, and you're sick with the flu, etc. And the short-term meaning of the event is easy to fill in. This one's bad, this one's good, 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 etc. But as you start to try and appreciate the long-term meaning of the event, you might start to, and you get to the end, where basically you realize just how terrible the trip to Paris ends up being. What happens is, all the different things that happen along the way, you start to realize that some of the things that seemed bad in the short term become good in the long term. All right? So, for example, when you get this to number 4, and your plane is delayed to the following day because of the bad weather and snow on the roads, all of a sudden, number 3 flips to good, because you got more rest and more time to prepare for the trip. So you overslept, no problem, but it turns out your flight was delayed anyways. So sometimes having more details gives us a larger picture and helps us understand that maybe something we thought was good or something we thought was bad can flip to the other way. We all know this from all the people that win the lottery, right? When someone wins the lottery, what's our reaction? Our immediate reaction is, wow, winning the lottery is such an amazing thing, it's such a good thing, etc. I would wish it on anybody that I know, right? Beautiful. However, when you start to realize what happens to people who win the lottery, like, for example, this is Jack Whitaker, who actually won $314 million, and who I'm sure at the time was very, very happy, etc. But some of the results of that story were that his granddaughter became very, very spoiled as a result of it. She got involved in drugs, and eventually she was found dead, having overdosed.
Oh, God.
Now, at that point, if you would have asked Jack Whitaker, he might have said, the lottery was still worth it, but I wish that hadn't happened. I wish I had made different decisions, etc., right? But Jack Whitaker also ended up divorced from his wife and ended up a lonely man because he didn't know if anybody was out for his money or out for him, etc. Until at some point, what happens? He eventually says, winning the lottery is the worst thing that ever happened to me. I'm sharing this not because winning a lottery is a horrible thing to happen. I wish to all of you that you should win the lottery, and you should have the foresight to be able to know how to deal with it and what to do with it, and to get a good financial planner, and to not let the money get to your head or to anyone else's head, right? And you can have a good thing, which is also a good thing. But sometimes a good thing is a bad thing, and sometimes a bad thing is a good thing, right?
Right.
That's the point that we're making. So I guess what we're trying to say is that, and by the way, if you want a literature version of this, raise hand. Anybody read John Steinbeck's The Pearl? Right, briefly, just to go through it briefly. Gloria, you read it?
No, I haven't.
Oh, no. Okay, Elise read it. Elise, you remember it? You want to summarize it for us?
I don't remember it that well.
Oh, you don't remember it? Okay, I'll tell you.
That's a long time ago.
What was that?
Too long ago. Okay.
Okay. In very short, a brief synopsis is that there's a poor fisherman who finds a rare and expensive pearl, but on his way to sell it, bandits come after him, and in their attempt to steal the pearl, the fisherman's young daughter gets killed. And at the end of the book, in a very moving passage, which we have here on the screen in front of us, Elise, you want to read it for us? The fisherman takes the pearl and hurls it back into the sea, and what does he say? What does John Steinbeck finish off? No, Elise, you're muted, sorry.
They watched the pearl splash into the Gulf and settle to the bottom of the sea among the algae and seaweed, and the music of the pearl drifted to a whisper and disappeared.
In other words, this pearl, which seemed to be a big blessing when it came originally, ended up being the biggest curse, and he would have rather not have it, and he hurls it into the sea. Okay, so this is basically the first point that we're trying to make, that sometimes appreciating the larger picture, or maybe not even appreciating the larger picture, appreciating that God has a larger picture that we don't see, can help us cope with suffering. Now again, I'm going to reiterate it as we go through the entire lesson. Again, a reminder, if your best friend comes to you and says my spouse was just diagnosed with stage 3 cancer, whatever it is, right? Your reaction is not, well, look at the bigger picture. I'm sure God has a plan. It's all going to be. No. The reaction is to hug them and say that's horrible and to be empathetic to them, etc. But the question is, when we go through suffering in our own lives, small, large, lo yaleinu, and we shouldn't have anything, but whatever suffering we do go through, we should be able to tell ourselves that there's a larger picture and that Hashem has it in mind. By the way, I just want to say, we can get exhaustive with this. I'm sure some of you are familiar. I'm just going to reference these. I'm not going to say them. There's 2 stories in the Talmud. One of them is about a man named Nachum Ish Gamzu. His name was Nachum, and he was called Gamzu because he always said, Gamzu Latova, this too is for the good. And there's multiple stories about him traveling and things, terrible things happening to him, and how he used to say, this too is for the good, and then eventually it turned out that it was for the good. There's a story of Rabbi Akiva, who was once in the forest and also was beset by all sorts of troubles. And he said, anything that God does is for the good. And eventually it turned out that all the things that happened to him actually saved his life. In the beginning it seemed like it was terrible, but it actually saved his life. There's so many stories about it. Now the stories are all inspiring one after the other, but they never really help us in our lives. Why? Because that's not what's going to happen in my life. You know what I mean? If I end up finding myself jumping out of an airplane with a parachute, and there's a hole in the parachute, it might not be that there's going to be a haystack or a pitchfork or water or whatever it is. My story might be different, and we never know what the larger picture is for our story. So, I guess what the takeaway we're trying to say is that even if we don't know what the larger picture is, we can have trust in Hashem that He has a larger picture. Okay. But sometimes we don't see the good that's resulting from a particular life experience. It seems to be just terrible. And no matter how large the picture is, we don't seem to be able to see this large picture. And we are left asking ourselves, hold on a second. How do I deal with this without knowing the larger picture? I can say that Hashem knows the larger picture, but I don't. How do I deal with it? So it turns out that there is a very, very powerful tool that we have, which is that we can actually ascribe meaning to pain. Okay? And if you ascribe meaning to pain, it doesn't make the pain any less, but it makes the suffering less. Let me explain that. First of all, we have to clarify what we mean when we say pain and what we mean when we say suffering. Pain is a physical experience. Pain is an emotional experience. It's something we're going through. Suffering actually happens in the brain. We'll soon talk about how even scientifically they've identified that pain and suffering happen in 2 different places. Suffering is actually something that to a large degree we do to ourselves. Nobody else can make you suffer. Why? When you can tell yourself a reason for something, even if that reason is not true, if you can tell yourself a reason for something, you can endure pain for much longer. Here's my favorite example. When someone hasn't exercised in years, and then they're inspired one day, whatever it is, they came to a wellness seminar at Chabad of Pasadena, and Rabbi Shmari Richter told them, exercise, run, this, whatever, and they become inspired, I'm going to get back into shape. Anybody ever been down this path before? I feel like all of us, yeah. Right? Okay. Uh-huh. What happens the first day after exercise?
Pain.
You're sore. You went for a run, you went to the gym, you went for a swim, whatever it is. Now you're in pain. Now you're sore. Is that suffering? No. I've never heard of anybody call that suffering. Even on the run, in the middle of the workout with the gym teacher, they're halfway through it and they're in pain. I've never heard anybody call that suffering. The reason you don't hear people calling that suffering is because it isn't. There's a story that you tell yourself in your head that reminds you that there's purpose in what you are doing. There is a meaning that we ascribe to the pain, in this case, to become more fit and to become more healthy, etc., and lead a healthier lifestyle, that we tell ourselves the pain is worth it. So does that make the pain any less? No. But the suffering actually disappears completely. And this is a very, very prominent idea, a very, very prominent theme in Viktor Frankl's story of life, and most notably in his book. I recommended it already in a previous lesson. I'm not going to link it again after this lesson, but still, a very, very powerful book. Any conversation about the Holocaust is not complete without it. It's a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, in which he makes the following point. Ron, since you just arrived, we're on page 100. We'll ask you to read for us, please, text 2.
I mean, 100.
Take your time.
All right. Any attempt to restore a man's inner strength in the camp had first to succeed in showing him some future goal. Nietzsche's words, "He who has a why to live for, can bear with almost any how," could be the guiding motto regarding prisoners. Whenever there was an opportunity for it, one had to give them a why and aim for their lives in order to strengthen them to bear the terrible how of their existence. Woe to him who saw no more sense in his life, no aim, no purpose, and therefore no point in carrying on. He was soon lost. What was really needed was a fundamental change in our attitude toward life. We had to learn ourselves, and furthermore, we had to teach the despairing men that it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life and instead to think of ourselves as those who were being questioned by life daily and hourly. Our answer must consist not in talk and meditation, but in right action and in right conduct. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks with which it constantly sets for each individual. When a man finds that it is his destiny to suffer, he will have to accept his suffering as his task. No one can relieve him of his suffering or suffer in his place. His unique opportunity lies in the way in which he bears his burden.
I find, okay, so Viktor Frankl is making a very, very powerful point. We're going to analyze it soon, step by step. But before we do that, I find that Viktor Frankl's wisdom is most appreciated when you see it. And again, that's why you have to read the book. When you hear it or see it on the background of his story. Dr. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish Holocaust survivor, and he later went on to found logotherapy. Well, he had started before the war, and then after the war, it really took off. His logotherapy looks at life in a very different way from most other psychotherapy, theories. It looks to the healthy spiritual core of man, believing that every person deep down at their core is good, for resources of healing, instead of analyzing, pathology, till the end, all the way till you go crazy. The definition of logotherapy is very important because this is exactly the point that he's making in this text that we just read. Logotherapy means, logos means meaning. That's the Greek term logos, right? As in pathos, logos, ethos. I mixed them up. Usually it's translated as like word or will of God in like religious circles, but in a broader sense, it can just be viewed as something, something that gives us meaning. That's the way Frankl prefers it. And when Frankl arrived at the camps, he saw certain amazing experiences which really confirmed what he believed was the inner core of human beings being good. And this point that he makes in this text will really help us as we talk about reframing our challenges, reframing our suffering to give them meaning. Even if that meaning might be made up and that meaning might not be true, it might be just a meaning that we tell ourselves. Let me explain. The first point that he makes is that life has meaning under all circumstances. In other words, in his view, meaning and purpose, a person having meaning and purpose in their lives is the most powerful dynamic within the human psyche. By the way, little parenthetical here, if this is a topic that interests you, as you're going through life, you ascribing meaning to your life, or you discovering the pre-existing purpose of your life. If this is a topic that interests you, first of all, I recommend Man's Search for Meaning. But if you'd like to hear about it from a Torah perspective, the next course we're giving at the Pasadena Jewish Academy, starting on November 3rd, after the holidays, is going to be what's called the Kabbalah of meaning. In other words, we're going to turn to Kabbalah and to Hasidism to understand not just how to live a meaningful life, but how to really understand what meaning of life is all about, how that works, to live life, to make our lives richer. It's not just, we know what the meaning of life is. Torah, Connect Hashem, beautiful. But we're going to do it in a very deep and powerful way. Anyways, I just wanted to throw that in there. It just occurred to me as I'm explaining this point. So in other words, according to Viktor Frankl, the most important, I would say Judaism agrees with this point, the most important factor in life at any point, the most important factor of the human psyche is to be able to ascribe meaning to something. The second point that Frankl makes, which I think Judaism would not agree as much with it, is he says that it's up to people themselves to figure out how they're going to ascribe meaning to something. They can make it up, they can discover it, they can hear it from someone else, whatever they want. But it's up, every single human being has the power to ascribe that meaning to something. Now, the reason I say Judaism disagrees with this is because according to Judaism, the meaning is actually predetermined by the Torah, right? By God. So as religious people, it's the same idea, but instead of us ascribing it, we believe that there is one, and we're looking to discover it, the meaning that God has given us in this life. So that's where it's kind of the first Jewish tradition. But regardless, it leads us to point number 3, which is that we don't just have the freedom to passively find meaning or believe that there is meaning in a negative situation, but we actually have the ability to let that affect, not just internalize the dynamic, but actually allow it to express itself outwardly in our lives, that this is how I live my life based on this particular meaning that I ascribe to this event. Okay. Theoretical much? Yes. Let's move on. Let's move on to some examples like that. We can really take this idea and saddle it home and drive it home. Okay? We're going to start with a biblical example. The biblical example we are going to use is the story of Rivka. Rebecca, our matriarch, has a problem. What's her problem? She's pregnant, and it's a very, very difficult pregnancy. Gloria, if you can read for us, please, text 3. We'll see what she does as a result.
His wife was sterile, and Isaac pleaded with God for her sake. God granted his plea, and Rebekah became pregnant. But the children clashed inside her. And when this occurred, she asked, "Why is this happening to me?" She went to seek a message from God. God's word to her was, "Two nations are in your womb. Two governments will separate from inside you. The upper hand will go from one government to the other, and the greater one will serve the younger."
Fascinating little tidbit about Rebecca's life. Let's unpack what happened here. Rebecca had no children for many, many, many years. I believe according to the Medrash, it was 20 years. They were trying to conceive, they didn't have children. Yitzchak and Rivka, Isaac and Rebecca. She finally becomes pregnant. Pause. I want to talk about something. Your average woman that becomes pregnant after 20 years of attempting IVF and this one and that one and whatever, as painful as it is, as difficult as it is, usually they don't mind the suffering. Okay. For some reason, Rebecca is very bothered by the suffering that she has inside of her. Okay. Beautiful. Not beautiful, but okay, that's step 1. What does she do? She has so much pain that she starts to complain about it. What does she say when she complains about it? Better I should never have become pregnant at all. What on earth? What's going on here? Like for years you want to become pregnant. It's a little difficult. I mean, how painful could it have been? It's a little painful. It's very painful. Now all of a sudden you don't want to ever have been pregnant. Remember, this is before childbirth. This is just a pregnancy, right? Wow. Okay. But as difficult as these two elements are to understand, the next part of the story is even crazier. So she goes to a rabbi. She goes to the prophet that there was at that time. Beautiful. The Medrash tells us that it was Shem, that the yeshiva of Shem and Eber, the son of Noach, who had a prophetic tradition. Beautiful. What does the prophet tell her? The prophet tells her, there's 2 nations inside of you, and the whole world is not going to be big enough for them. They're going to fight until Mashiach comes. It's not just, you don't just have two children, it's you have two antithetical nations to each other. And they're going to fight it out all the way to the end of the world. So the whole world is not going to be big enough for them. For sure, in the womb, it's complicated. This, for some reason, calms Rebecca down. That's the end of that story in the Torah. And we never hear about it again. We never, ever hear about it again. So the question is, what happened? What changed? Why was it so difficult for her? And why did this random answer, like did the pain go away just because the prophet told her that it's two separate nations inside of you and it's going to be a whole world war? The pain didn't go away. The only thing that changed was that Rebecca was given a why. And what did we learn? When you're given a why, you can withstand any how. Nietzsche said it. Viktor Frankl developed a whole theory based on it. This idea that if you can ascribe meaning to your pain, whatever that meaning is, if you can look in the Torah and come up with a reason, not even a reason, a meaning to make your pain meaningful. Rebecca is experiencing tremendous pain. The only thing she wants to know is, tell me that there's a reason behind it. Tell me that there's something meaningful behind it. And then I can withstand it, no problem. And that's indeed what happens. This becomes even more front and center. This crystallizes even more when we begin to appreciate some of the science behind this. I haven't read her book, but apparently Temple Grandin has a book called Animals in Translation. And on page 184 to 187, I'm just giving you the quote that they have for us here, she makes a fascinating point, which is, she says that there's a huge disjunction in our brains between pain and suffering. Apparently, while it is the mid part of the brain that perceives pain, in other words, you burn your finger, right? It's the middle part of your brain that actually perceives the pain, but it's the frontal lobe that makes us suffer. It's the frontal lobe that says, I'm such a ditz, that I'm such a yatzmach, that I touched the fire when it was, or the pot, or whatever it was, when it was so hot, and I burnt myself, etc. That's the suffering that we put ourselves through. In other words, it's a completely different part of the brain. One part of the brain is much more animalistic in nature. It's just an instinctual reaction, pain. But the other one, the suffering, is what we do to ourselves when we process that pain in a certain way, and we say it's so terrible that I'm experiencing this pain. And it's the reason why we can go to the dentist and experience the pain, but it's all worth it because then the wisdom teeth are going to come out, or then the crown is going to be put on, the root canal will be out, whatever it is, and now the suffering will stop. Right now the pain will stop. So the pain that we experience from the dentist, we say to ourselves in our brain that it's worth it, and then it ceases to be suffering, or at least the suffering becomes a lot less. I can get really exhausted with this. I can go on and on about it. There's a story with Bruria in the Talmud, and how she explains to her husband, Rabbi Meir, when they lose two of their children, they die in their sleep. They die from an illness. Over and over again. What we see is a consistent theme that it's all about ascribing meaning to the pain. And if you can ascribe meaning to the pain, then what happens is the pain stops being suffering and it becomes just pain. Hold on a moment, let me just look at the time. I think we have 3-4 minutes. Actually, I think we're doing well on time. I'll tell the story of Bruria. Bruria was the wife of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir was one of the sages in the Mishnah that are brought down in the Talmud all the time. Rabbi Meir had 2 children, and one day on Shabbat, while Rabbi Meir was out, both children died of an illness. I guess they had been ill, in and out, and they died in their beds. And Bruria covers them over, and her husband comes home and he can detect that something happens. He says to her, "What's wrong?" So she says, "Nothing's wrong. Everything's fine." She says, "Let's make Havdalah." Rabbi Meir makes Havdalah, and right after Havdalah, before he again asks, he says, "Where are my sons?" And she says to him, "Let's talk about it in a moment. I want to just ask you a question. Because I have a Talmudic question." Bruria was famously a very Talmudic sage in and of her own right. She was a very well learned woman. She's often quoted in the Talmud as an opinion, among there, together with all the great sages of the Talmud. So Bruria says to Rabbi Meir, "I have a question on a Talmudic passage." What's the question? So she says to him, if a man is given two items for safe giving, for safekeeping, and he watches them, And then the owner comes back and he wants them back. But the man has grown attached to these two items. Maybe let's use the example of pet sitting, right? I go to Paris for a nice vacation with Getty. I leave two of my pets with Elise. I say, Elise, can you watch the pets? She's so kind. She watches the pets. I don't have pets. This is purely theoretical. Elise, don't worry. You're not going to have to watch my dogs. Okay. And I give Elise my two dogs to watch over them, but I'm gone Getty and I are gone for a month. We come back. We come to Elise. We say, we want the dogs back. She's like, no, I want to hold on to them. So Bruria says to Mayor, what's the deal? What's the halacha? What's the Jewish law? She says, not even a question. The owner, they have to be rightfully returned to the owner. They were only given for safekeeping. They have to give them back. So she says to him, God has given us two precious gifts for safekeeping. They were ours for X amount of years, and now he wanted them back. And she brings them to the other room, and then Mayor sits Shiva. The question is, what was Bruria trying to accomplish with this whole story? Was she really trying to make that the pain should go away? Does she really think that by telling a story like this, she's somehow going to save Rabbi Meir from the emotional torment of losing two children? The answer is no. She's trying to mitigate the suffering. Right? She's trying to say, yes, you will have pain, but I don't want you to have suffering. I want you to be able to find meaning in that suffering and to understand that the mission that these two children came down to this world for is over, and to remind him of that before he's going to experience a tremendous amount of pain, during which time he will need to have a tremendous presence of mind in order to understand the pain and not turn it into suffering. She wants to assist him with that. That's what's going on. Because when we apply meaning to painful events, just like when we exercise what we say the pain is worth it, then that we can lessen the suffering that we are going to experience. So let's go back and read text 3. Did God's answer through the prophet to Rebecca, did it cause the fetuses to stop struggling? No. The pain stayed even afterwards. But it did help Rebecca to deal with the pain. Why? Because she had an explanation in her head. Because she had meaning that was ascribed to her. What I'm doing here is meaningful. Therefore, the suffering went away and the pain was manageable and dealable. This brings us to the second part of our lesson, which is, how do we live with faith during times of suffering? Rebecca and Bruria were able to do so. They imbued their pain with a sense of meaning. Therefore, it was easier to mitigate the suffering, even if not the pain. But let me ask you guys a question. Do you think that Rebecca and Bruria experienced suffering and therefore tapped into a sense of faith that they had within them? In other words, do you think this lifestyle began when they started to suffer? Absolutely not. They had a sense of emunah, a sense of faith in God that they lived with. And just when crisis came, they obviously viewed that crisis through the framework of the emunah, of the faith that they had. This sheds a lot of light onto the way survivors of the Holocaust were able to maintain faith during the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. Those who already possessed faith, who already possessed some framework for dealing with these sorts of things, were able to apply that and have a powerful means of coping with the events that were going on around them. You know, the conventional wisdom is that survivors tended to radically alter their framework for life after the war. I'm sure that was true for many, many different survivors. But there's this myth that most people who believed in God before the Holocaust had a very difficult time or dropped it entirely, had a very difficult time believing in God after the Holocaust, or dropped it entirely. And there's actually work that's been done on this. There's research that's been done on this. I'll pull it up here. In his book, The Faith and Doubt of Holocaust Survivors, Reeve Robert Brenner does exactly this. He spends a lot of time analyzing what people's lives were like from a faith perspective, beforehand to afterwards. And by the time we're done, okay, you'll notice that, first of all, most people, if they were believers before the Holocaust, they tended to be believers after the Holocaust. If they were non-believers before the Holocaust, they tended to be non-believers after the Holocaust. In other words, for the most part, whatever your lifestyle was, that's what you retained afterwards as well, despite the fact that you might have wrestled with it in the middle. Now, there are those that changed, but you'll notice that even among the 21%, okay, 21%, in other words, 79% for the most part retained whatever beliefs they had beforehand. 63% was completely unchanged. Okay, another 16% was reinforced or weakened, or more. Sorry, even more than that was weakened or reinforced. Beautiful, but the most radical changes was only 21%. 21% of those people who experienced the Holocaust either went from being believers to becoming non-believers, or from being non-believers to becoming believers. And it wasn't all one direction. 3/4 of those people, 75% of those people became went from being believers to becoming non-believers. And those are probably the people that we use as anecdotal data when we think that everybody stopped believing in God. But there's actually 5% of people that had the opposite experience. Through, I guess Viktor Frankl would fall into this category. We'll soon see the end of his story. Through his experience in the Holocaust, what happens is he goes from being a non-believer to becoming a believer. And by the way, this study is from 1980. As you move on in life, a more current study would actually show, well, today most Holocaust survivors have passed on in this world. But if you had taken a study 20 years ago, the results probably would have been even further in that direction. Why? Because to just say people stop believing in God is to assume that their entire lives were a binary, before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. When in reality, they had a whole life beforehand, with a framework for how they dealt with suffering. Then there was this huge event, which was the Holocaust. And then there were many, many years afterwards. One of my pet peeves is that many, many people have read Night. I mentioned this earlier in this course. Many people have read Night by Elie Wiesel, which is his first memoir, in which he comes across as a very, very strong non-believer. He doesn't believe in God anymore. How could God have allowed the Holocaust to happen? All the good questions, etc. And yes, while it's true that in that moment, he was in a very dark place and he couldn't find faith. He couldn't allow his faith to shine through. But as life moved on, if you read his later memoirs, you see that actually he develops a very firm belief in God. What happens? He's a human being. And as he goes through his life, his faith and his belief in Hashem becomes more and more prominent and more dominant in his lifestyle. I guess the point that we're trying to make based on this study is the point that Yosef HaTzadik makes to his brothers. Yosef HaTzadik, in one line in the Torah, you see the tremendous journey that he had gone on. When he finally reveals himself to his brothers, and his brothers are so embarrassed over the fact that this is Joseph, their brother, what does he say to them? He says, Atem chashavtem alai l'ra. You tried to do unto me evil. Elokim chashav l'tova. But God meant it for the good. He's telling them, yes, it's true that you put me in a very difficult situation, but I have been on a journey since then. On the first day I woke up and I said, I'm paraphrasing for Yosef HaTzadik, and maybe I shouldn't. But on the first day, maybe he woke up and he said, I don't believe in God anymore. How could God put me through this suffering, etc. And over the many years, the 22 years of his estrangement from his family, he thought the story over and over and over again. He grew as a human being, and he slowly developed a mature and foundational emunah, or belief in God, to the point that by the time he reached meeting his brothers at the end of the 22 years, he actually didn't just forgive them, but he didn't even believe that it was up to them. He believed that it was God that had made this whole story happen for the good. You know, I think a lot of us suffer from a very, very curable issue, which is because the first time that we tend to think about these issues, we think about them as an 8-year-old, or as a 6-year-old, or as a 4-year-old. We often develop some sort of a notion of God, and then we leave it. We never revisit it. When the truth is that thinking about our faith in God, thinking about our relationship with God, should be something that evolves with us as human beings. When you're a mature 40, 50, 60-year-old person, you actually have to start thinking about it in that context. So faith plays a tremendous, tremendous role, but it's something that needs to be nurtured. It's something that we need to allow it to grow together with us. And the best way to talk about this is through the paradigm of text 4. Okay, text 4 is from the Talmud. The Talmud makes this fascinating statement. Elise, if you can read it for us, please, about a thief. Text 4. Elise, you want to unmute? We're on page 102. Go ahead. Text 4.
Okay. A thief at the entrance to the tunnel as he goes to steal calls out in prayer to God.
In the times of the Talmud, they observed something fascinating. You have thieves who, not just a thief, but a thief who it's his career to be a thief. And he's calling out to God right as he's about to start his undercover mission to go steal from someone else and take their belongings, which is totally antithetical to what God would want him to do. So you have 3 steps here. There's three things that we notice about the thief. Number 1, he believes that God exists. Number 2, he doesn't just believe that God exists. He believes that it's God who would determine whether he'll be successful in this thieving operation or not. And number 3, he also believes that God listens to prayer. So pray tell, why is he stealing? If you have this person who doesn't just believe in God, he believes that God is intimately involved in my life. He decides whether I'll be successful or not. That's why he's praying to him, because he believes that prayer works, that he can ask God to be successful at stealing. But yet he's stealing, which is the opposite of what God wants. Why would he do so? So Chassidus explains that to varying degrees, you know who the thief is? The thief is us. At different times in our lives, we behave that way. We behave in a way where we believe in something, but we're contradicting ourselves. We live in contradiction. We live in a way where we are contradicting ourselves. You've all been there, okay? Think about it. If somebody were to ask you at the height of your career, if somebody were to come over to me right now and say to me, Rabbi Zushi, do you believe in spending time with your family? I would say absolutely. What do you think the most important thing in life is? Spending time with my family. I should spend as much time with my family as I'd like to. And then they'll turn to me and say, Rabbi Zushi, how much time yesterday was Sunday, how much time did you spend with your family? I'll tell them, well, I had a men's club in the evening and a rap club in the morning, and then I gave a class, and then I taught in Hebrew school and whatever, and by the time the day was over and I had to go pick up groceries and whatever, by the time the day was over, I basically spent, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes all day with my family.
Oh.
So hold on a second. What does this mean? Does it mean that I don't believe in spending time with my family? No, of course I believe in spending time with my family, right? So then why is it that there's such a disconnect between what I believe and what I do? If I were to walk up to any member of our congregation and say, Rabbi Yid, you believe in giving tzedakah? I have a feeling they would all answer yes. I don't think anybody would say, I don't believe in giving tzedakah. I don't believe in giving charity, right? And if my follow-up question would be, we need $1,000 to make ends meet at the end of the month, a much smaller percentage of them would actually give the $1,000. What happens? So sometimes there's an answer. Oh, yesterday I was so busy, that's why I didn't spend time with my family. Oh, I can't really give $1,000 right now because of this and because of that. It's such a hard time for me right now, etc. And those answers might all be true. But if you really believe in these things, why aren't you living up to what you believe in? The answer is that there are 2 different aspects of belief. There are 2 different elements of emunah. What in Hebrew are called makif and panini. Makif means it surrounds us. It's peripheral. Okay? And ironically, even though it's peripheral and it surrounds us, this doesn't mean that it's external to us. This doesn't mean that it's superficial to us, that it's tacked on to us. Quite the contrary. There is a deep, 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 deep core of us, which is very, very strongly connected to God. We call it the neshama. At that level, at the etzem of the neshama, at the core and the essence of our soul, we believe in God no matter what. Right? And at that core, it's very, very strong on the one hand, because it never leaves you. The Talmud uses the phrase, "Anachnu ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim," we are believers, the sons of believers. It's a belief that we inherit just by being Jewish. But on the other hand, it's very peripheral. It doesn't ooze out into day-to-day life. And it's up to us to develop that peripheral belief and turn it into a pervasive and internal and actually effective an actionable faith. Think about a man who professes his love to his spouse but doesn't do anything to express that love or care for her. What does that mean? Does that mean he doesn't love her? No, I believe that man. He does love her. But he needs to work on taking that deep, makif dika, or makif-esque, peripheral love. He needs to turn it into something pervasive, into something that pervades his actions throughout his life. And the $1,000,000 question is how? We know that that's what we need to do. Take a look at text 5. Text 5 is from the prophet Habakkuk, where he tasks us with this. He says, you know what a righteous person is? You know what a tzaddik is? The righteous shall live by his faith. How fascinating is that? He says a righteous person is not someone who has faith. I'm sure he believes in a person having faith. But a righteous person is someone who lives by his faith. You have to figure out how to live by it. You have to figure out how to turn that into actionable actions. The $1,000,000 question is how? How do we do so? How do we get the emunah, the deep-seated belief that we have in Hashem, to actually affect our lives? I'll share with you a personal story. There's a fellow who comes all the time here to Chabad. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying his name, but I won't say it just in case, to protect the innocent, as my father-in-law says. The first time I asked him, hey, brother, you want to put on tefillin? He looked at me and he said, Rabbi, I don't believe in God. And I looked at him and I said, don't worry about it. You don't need to believe in God. Your soul believes in God. 3 minutes later, he was wrapping tefillin with me. And he loves to tell that story over and over and over again. And he still sometimes will say, I'm an atheist Jew who puts on tefillin, he'll post it on Facebook, etc., with pictures, etc., the whole thing. But over and over again, he'll come to my house for Shabbat dinner, and he'll come to classes, and he'll learn Torah, and he'll study, and he'll pray, and he'll come to Shul Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and even on Shabbat sometimes if I push him hard enough. What's going on here? This is exactly what's going on. There are two sides to it. There is having faith, that every Jew has. But then there's acting on your faith, and that's a much more difficult thing to do. It's like dieting, right? We all want to lose weight. Doing it, that's a much more difficult thing to do. We have to figure out how to get the market, the peripheral idea, the peripheral desire that we have to do something to actually become actionable. And so the question is, how do we do that? It turns out, linguistics will help us. The etymology of the actual word will help us. Ron, if you can read for us, please, text 6a. Where does the word emunah come from? Where does the word belief, the Hebrew word for belief, come from?
Also implicit in the word emunah, faith, is that it is a term indicating training to which a person habituates himself like a craftsman who trains his hands and so forth.
And keep reading text 6b, which is the Tanya elaborating on this idea. I'm sorry, the commentary on the Tanya elaborating on the idea from Tanya.
Like a craftsman who trains his hands, he is cognizant of the craft in his soul. He has a natural talent for it, but needs only to train his hands so that it will find tangible expression in his actions, be it through art or fashioning vessels or the like.
So here we have the Rebbe explaining the Alter Rebbe. Our Rebbe explaining the first Chabad Rebbe, right? The current Chabad Rebbe explaining the ideas that the first Chabad Rebbe put in. And essentially, they're all dealing with the same question that we just brought up. Do you believe in frequent exercise? Do you believe in eating healthy? Do you believe in giving charity? I have a feeling the answer to anybody watching this class today or in 20 years from now finding it on YouTube, the answer will be the same. Yes, of course they do. The problem is, it's difficult to actually do it. So what's the solution? The solution, my friends, is to practice, is to train. And it turns out that is the power of Emunah. That is the power of training ourselves in what we do. So the word Emunah means faith, but it comes from the same word as uman, a craftsman, or imun, to train, which means that if we can work on that, if we can every single day try and work on ourselves to have more faith and to practice and to train and to implement that faith into our lives, then we will get better at it. Just like somebody who wants to lose weight should not try to just believe in losing weight. He should believe that it's true. He shouldn't spend years and years studying it. He should believe that it's true, and then he should go out there and make one tiny difference. Start practicing it. Start flexing that muscle, the muscle of eating less and of eating at the right times and eating the right things, and eating nutritionally, etc. All the different things that we know that lead to losing weight, that needs to become a training grounds for him. Just like an artist who wants to be good at something and needs 10,000 hours under his belt, so he's going to train and practice and train and practice, faith, it works the same way. Bruria, my friends, and Rivka, and all the people that we discussed earlier were people that had this framework before the Holocaust. They had this framework before their personal tragedy. They had this framework before they were in crisis. And then when the crisis struck, all that practice came into being. They lived their lives like this on a daily basis. What does that mean? Every time they had a small sense of pain, what did they do? They said, I don't want to suffer through this pain. They ascribed meaning to it. They tried to figure out ways to actually live through it and not to view it as suffering. And so therefore, when those big moments came, they applied those same things to it. And who better to look back at but King David? We opened up today's lesson by quoting King David, who seems to, it was a big paradox. King David seems to believe that God has forsaken him, but he still believes in God. Why does he believe in God? What's going on here? What does it mean that he believes that God has forsaken him, God is abandoning him? What's going on here? It seems that he has no faith. But it turns out that's not the end of King David's story. As many of you know, because if you go through lots of different Psalms, in the book of Tehillim, you'll see that usually, overwhelmingly, the attitude is the opposite. Let's take a look at text 7, one of the most famous Psalms. Mark, if you can read it for us, please. Psalm 23. What does King David say?
A song of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He causes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even when I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You set a table before me in the presence of my adversaries. You anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. May only goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord for length of days.
Contrast this versus the earlier selection from Psalm 22. What has changed for King David in his relationship with God? You know what's changed? It's changed from just being, from emunah, faith, just being a word. Oh, I believe in God, I believe in God, I believe in God. Oh, life is tough. I don't believe in God anymore. Oh, life is tough. God has abandoned me. It's changed it to something developed. Think about the words that he's using here. Why do you think King David expresses his feelings by calling God his shepherd? You know that King David himself was a shepherd. Not only was he a shepherd, he suffered tremendous suffering in his life. And when he was a shepherd, that's why he was a shepherd, by the way. All of his older brothers went to go fight in war and pursue glorious careers, and he was left to tend to the flock, right? But what is his analogy of the shepherd? He knows that God selected him as a shepherd based on his unique way of shepherding his flock. The Medrash tells us that King David, the way that he shepherded his flock was very unique. He noticed that often as he would take the sheep out to pasture, the young and strong sheep would go and eat the grass first. And once they were full, they would move on. And then all that was left was the very difficult grass to eat for the older and slower sheep to eat. And they often couldn't do it and weren't able to eat enough, and they were suffering as a result of it. So King David established a whole system with pens for his sheep. At first he would let out the older sheep, and the older sheep would eat the top part of the grass, which was easier to access, and then he would let out the younger sheep would eat a whole thing. He cared for every single sheep in their way. And with these words, King David turns to God. Now with a developed and with a mature sense of a relationship with God. Not just, I believe in God. I believe in God. I believe there's meaning in my pain. I believe that God cares for me so much that he would make sure that no matter what's going on, he would take care of me like a shepherd takes care of his flock, like I take care of my flock. Right? But then comes the obvious question. Mizmor LeDavid Hashem Roi. A psalm by David, God is my shepherd. But then what does he continue? Though I may walk in the valley of the shadow of death. Hold on a second. I thought you said God is your shepherd. I thought you said God takes care of everything. So why are you walking in the shadow of death? Once King David's story gets off and running, what happens? He goes from being a shepherd boy to the front story. He rises to power after the story with David and Goliath. Then eventually he marries the daughter of the king. Beautiful, right? Everything seems to be going great. And then God throws him into the valley of the shadow of death. His own father-in-law, there's lots of people that don't get along with their father-in-law. I don't know any of them. Their father-in-law spends a good portion of his life pursuing his son-in-law in order to kill him. But that's the relationship between King Saul and King David, right? And as he is going through the valley of the shadow of death, whatever that challenge is, by the way, the commentary, they provide a plethora of different versions of what that might be. Either the fact that he was pursued by King Saul, or maybe it was a physically dangerous place that he was walking through, or maybe he was just talking about all the evils of this world. Regardless, when we read this, we think about the shadow of death, the valley of the shadow of death in our own life, our own challenging, our own suffering, our own pain. But yet what happens? King David is still calling him a shepherd. He's still saying that God cares for him. This is why we find Psalm 23 so comforting. This is why Psalm 23 appears over and over and over again in our own prayers. All the time we say it. Whenever we're about to go into a difficult situation, or if something currently a difficult situation is going on, we will often read Psalm 23 together. Why do we do that? We do that because we are trying to internalize the words of King David, that even as we're walking through the difficult and painful and tragic moments of our lives, still Hashem is with us. We believe that Hashem is with us. These ideas, we believe that God has a larger picture. We believe that there might be other things that we don't see that God sees. We believe that this bad thing that I'm experiencing now might actually be a good thing. These ideas, which are expressed in Tanya, can be very comforting to a person and can really help them as they go along. They're expressed in a few places in Tanya. One of the most notable places is in the fifth section of Tanya. The fourth section of Tanya, which we're actually going through right now. We read it a few weeks ago in the daily section of Tanya. For those that go through the daily reading of Tanya. And the letter, it's a letter from the Alter Rebbe, from the first Chabad Rebbe, which is called Lahaskil Chabina. And there's a Hasidic tradition of people that were suffering, that just like people read Psalm 23, they would also read this chapter of Tanya. I'll give you two stories. One story that's told is that the Rebbe's grandfather was very, very ill in Dnepropetrovsk, and there was a Chassid that went every single day to stand at the window of his bedroom while he hovered between life and death, and he would read out loud Lahaskil Chabina, this chapter of Tanya, that describes these things that we're talking about. The fact that yes, things are painful in life, and you cannot change the pain in life, but you can change the suffering by appreciating that there's actually good within the bad, by appreciating that you might see this as bad, but to God sees this as good because he has a larger picture, because he sees more, right? This whole chapter that talks about this, he read it over and over and over again. And when the Rebbe's grandfather recovered, he came to that chassid and he said to him, hold on. He came to that chassid and he said to him, your reading of the Haskil Chabina, that was what comforted me. That was what got me through it. He didn't even realize that he was able to hear it. I'll tell you another story, much more recent. Rabbi Mendel Futterfass. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. He's a famous chassid, passed away in 1995. He sat in the Gulag for 8 years, and even after he came out, he was finally reunited with his family. He was separated from his family for years. Eventually, he lost his son. I think his name was Beryl. He lost his son to a terrible, terrible illness. And at the funeral, Hasidim reported that they heard him talking to himself and saying, Aber Mendel, was ist mit Lahaskil Chabina? He was talking to himself, but Mendel, what is with Lahaskil Chabina? In other words, these are people that had this sense, this framework of how to have faith in difficult times. They had it throughout their whole lives. And they were human beings in their pain just like everybody else. But in that moment of pain, they had the framework for how to survive it. They had the framework for attaching meaning to their pain so that they didn't need to suffer as much. They were able to attach meaning to their suffering so that now, even if that doesn't stop them from feeling the very tangible and emotional and ripping pain that they're going through, but they're able to understand, able to comfort themselves that though they walk in the valley of the shadow of death, God is with them. There were those during the Holocaust that managed to do this. And if we want to learn from the story of the Holocaust, if we want to learn from those stories and that it should speak to us today, We need to learn to do this even without suffering tragedy like they did. But there were those, and again, remember, the goal of this lesson is to take unique, individual, personal stories and apply them to our lives and learn from those people. And there were those who managed to do so. Let's start with a little video, and then we'll do some texts. And all of them are trying to drive home the same idea. This idea that wherever you are in life, you can choose to tap into your inner faith and allow that to guide you. Let me just change the, adapt the sharing for the video screen. There we go. Please turn your attention to the video screens.
TorahCafe.com.
The survivors of Bergen-Belsen remember the fear, the cold, the pain, the shame. Worst of all, they remember the constant, all-consuming hunger that left them no respite. Yet Rebbetzin Esther Jungreis recalls that even in those awful times, the most important source of nourishment was the bread of faith. Every day in Bergen-Belsen, her father made them count the days. 5 more days, 4 more days, 3 more days, 2 more days, 1 more day. And then, children, it will be Shabbos. Each day, he would hide away a few crumbs of his meager daily ration. And then, when Shabbos came, he would gather his children together in that hellhole and whisper to them in Yiddish,
Meine lichtige Kinderlach,
my precious lights, my children,
macht sie die Eugelach.
close your eyes and imagine that we are at home. Mama just baked delicious challah. Even as he spoke, he would bring forth those precious crumbs that he had saved at great sacrifice throughout the entire week. And in his sweet, beautiful voice, he would sing,
Shalom Aleichem.
Welcome, angels of Shabbos. In that moment, they were transported to a different time and place. They felt the warm glow of the candles and smelled the delicious fragrance of the Shabbos meal. They were enveloped in holiness and love as the angels held them close. On one occasion, the Rebbetzins' younger brother tugged at her father's hand and said, Tati, I don't see any malachim here. Where are the angels of Shabbos? Her father's eyes filled with tears, and in a trembling voice, he answered,
Ihr lichtige Kinderlach.
You, my precious lights, you are the angels of Shabbos. So it was that in Bergen-Belsen, they became the angels of Shabbos.
The reason I find this story so significant is for 2 reasons. First of all, obviously, it is an act of spiritual resistance, which we've been talking about over and over again in this course. The fact that that Jews under Nazi brutality were actually able to resist. Perhaps they didn't survive, and some of them did survive, and some of them didn't survive. But even though they may not have survived, they resisted by actually still standing. The Nazis just wanted to dehumanize them, and they still stood for something deeper. But in this story, there's also another powerful lesson. Look at how they're reframing their suffering. Look at how this is a man who is walking through the death camps, witnessing the most horrendous scenes, that he is accompanied by angels. He believes that this faith will take him through because the Nazis can take everything away from him, but they cannot take away his faith. They cannot take away the meaning that he will ascribe to his pain. They can make him suffer pain, but they cannot make him suffer suffering. They cannot make him, he will not give in to believing that this is who he is and who he's meant to be, and that's it, and that everything is meaningless. He will continue to stand for truth and for justice. Another powerful story are the words. I'm going to read them now. On page 106, we'll ask Mark to read them for us, please. These are the words of the chief rabbi of Rotterdam, Holland. Okay? These were the words that were disseminated among the members of his community who were summoned for deportation. It was kind of his last words to them. These are the final paragraphs of the document. Go ahead, Mark.
And finally, think about the following. A human being is not only the body we see, but also the invisible soul, that is the eternal thing within us, which remains even when the body succumbs. Every suffering has an end. No pain endures forever, but your soul is immortal. It will overcome the suffering in a world of peace and truth. And thus, there are three on which you can rely wherever you go: God, the Jewish community, and your own soul. All three are eternal, immortal. Choose life. That is the call of the most superb Jewish commandment. Keep up in every situation. Fulfill your obligation and task as a human being and as a Jew in faithfulness, with your entire will and strength.
Be strong.
Be strong.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
Be
sorry.
strong.
Be strong. Chazak.
Hazak.
The rabbi is making a few points to his community here. Not just his community, but to his community. They knew where they were going, and they knew where they were being deported to, etc. And maybe they felt helpless physically. But he's telling them, you do not need to be helpless spiritually. He's making the point that emunah, faith in God, is not a passive attitude. That it is by default. You have faith deep inside you. All you need to do is actually turn it into an active reality. You need to create the reality around you. You might have been someone who just went to shul and it was some Torah. So it was some Torah. And he's telling them, now you're going to go to the death camps where the Nazis are going to try to take that away from you. Don't let them take that away from you. I cannot do anything about the fact that they might take your life away from you. They might take your dignity away from you. They might take away your physical possessions, your physical life, etc. But do not let them take away your faith. Do not let them take away your spiritual identity. Do not let them take away the reality that you live in. Do not surrender by, in addition to feeling pain, also feeling suffering. That is the idea of choosing life. He's redefining this cardinal Jewish value, which we read about in the Torah. Before you today, the path of life and the path of death. Choose life. Seems like such a simple commandment. Choose life. Not so simple. Not so simple when they don't just want to take away your physical life, they want to take away your very meaning of life in your head. As Viktor Frankl puts it, don't let them take away the thing that you live for. Let's go through some more stories. Text 9. Elise, you like to read for us, please? This is because I love to point out that it wasn't just the believers. It wasn't just those that were observant, quote unquote. It was everyone. Go ahead.
9, right? Okay. The Germans came to Lublin to set up a Jewish area and ordered the chairman of the Judenrat to assemble the Jewish population in an open field outside the city for a general parade. As the Jews presented themselves at the appointed time, the German commander ordered them to sing a gay and happy Hasidic tune. The crowd were fearful and confused, but one hesitant voice started singing the moving song La Mir sich Eberrechten Vina Shabbat Shamayim. Let us be friends again, our Father in heaven. The crowd remained unresponsive. The German soldiers threw themselves with murderous blows upon the Jews who would not obey the command. Suddenly, a voice broke from among the crowd, singing the same tune with might and joy, but with the words now changed to Mir Velen Se Ilbeleben. Avinu Shabashamayim. We shall outlive them, our Father in heaven. The song gripped the crowd. They sang it with enthusiasm and danced it to it ecstatically. It became for them the hymn of Jewish eternity. The Germans, bewildered and at a loss, started shouting, "Stop it! Stop it!" Did they sense that it was the song of their doom?
So again, first of all, this is a story of spiritual resistance. There's no question about it. But this is also a story of taking your faith, creating your own story, holding on to your story and creating your reality, and not allowing the circumstances of life, or in this case, the abuse of others, to define it. And this, my friends, is a powerful lesson that we can take from the Holocaust. Because every single one of us has moments in our lives when we feel like someone else is controlling our story, and we shouldn't let someone else control it. To bring it home, Ron, you want to read for us, please? Text 10 on page 107 is another story, this time from a man whose name was Leib Langfuss. Leib was a member of the Sonderkommando in Birkenau. In other words, people who were forced to burn the bodies of those who had been gassed. And he kept a diary, and he hid it among the ashes. And it was found after the war. He didn't survive, but his diary did. You want to read for us, please, from his diary? Text 10.
Another entry in the diary of Leib Langfass, and the transport began arriving in the Birkenau concentration camp from Hungary, and two Jews turned to a member of our commando and asked him whether they should recite the Vidyu, the last confession before
Did you?
dying.
Yes.
And my comrades said yes. So they took a bottle of brandy and drank from it while shouting L'chaim, to life, to one another with true joy. And they insisted that my comrade drink too, but he felt too embarrassed and ashamed. And he said no, but they refused to let him go. They pressed him to drink, and to say L'chaim. And they said, "You must live, for you must avenge us. You must, therefore, we say to you, L'chaim, to life." And they kept on repeating, L'chaim, L'chaim. We understand one another, don't we? L'chaim. And my comrade drank with him, and he was so deeply moved that he began to weep. I confess that ever since I've read these documents, I find it difficult, even on Shabbat and on the holy days, to lift my glass and say L'chaim. But not to do so is tantamount to conceding defeat. So we continue to praise life, to do what others have done before us. Therein lies the strength of Jewish tradition. We repeat words and gestures that have come down to us through the centuries. We do it for ourselves, but not only for ourselves.
This is the idea we are trying to drive home in today's lesson. And we're going to finish off with one more quote from Eli Wiesel in just a moment. But we're trying to say that someone who has faith in God, they can choose, not just the faith, everybody has faith in God, deep down. But someone who practices and exercises that muscle can not just withstand anyhow, he can actually rise above it. He can be living in a concentration, he can be living in a death camp, but saying L'chaim. He can be living in a death camp, but he can be living with angels. He can be living in a death camp, but his mind, his attitude is not controlled. He's actually the one winning. The Nazis could be winning physically the war, but he is winning the spiritual battle. And in the end, as those precious Yidden sang in the death camps, we too will be able to sing Mir Velen Ze Iberleben. We will outlive them. Avinu Shabashamayim, God in heaven. We will outlive them. We'll conclude with the last word, with a final quote from Eli Wiesel. Elise, if you can read it for us, please, text 11.
Voltaire said, "When all hope is gone, death becomes a duty." Not so for Jews. When all hope is gone, Jews invent new hopes. Even in the midst of despair, we attempt to justify hope. We owe it to our past not to lose hope. Say what you will, despair is not the solution, not for us, quite the contrary. We must show our children that in spite of everything, we keep our faith in ourselves and even in mankind, though mankind may not be worthy of such faith. We must persuade our children and theirs that 3,000 years of history must not be permitted to end with an act of despair on our part.
This is an idea that Eli Wiesel began to live with as he developed, as he wrestled with living as a survivor, and he lectured publicly on it, and he mentioned this over and over again. And it's an idea that he discussed with the Rebbe on many occasions. Gloria, can you read for us, please, on the screen, this letter of the Rebbe to Eli Wiesel? Such a powerful, like marching orders, if you will.
To remember is indeed an imperative and a duty, particularly in light of the growing campaign to forget and to make forgotten. And yet remembering is only one part of the task that rests upon us. The other and far more crucial part is to actively counteract Hitler's so-called final solution. Your first duty is to live, to assume an ordered life, a married life, to establish a Jewish home and a Jewish family.
So the takeaway from today's lesson is without a doubt to live. But not just to live a proper life. When we sit here and we wrestle with what can I do in the suffering of my own life? What can I do in the face of the suffering of the Holocaust? What can I do after October 7th? You know what you can do? When a person chooses not just to live, but to live life to the fullest. He says, today I was thinking of having a terrible day, but because of Hamas, I am going to win over them and I am going to have an amazing day. They think they're going to control my day, right? They think they're going to control my life, that I'm going to feel like the whole world is out to get me, and I'm going to say, you know what? Screw you. I am going to live. I am going to live and resist what you want from me, which is to be beaten down and to not remarry, talking about people after the Holocaust, and to not raise a family, to not have children, and to not want to perpetuate the Jewish people, says Eli Wiesel, and this is a topic that him and the Rebbe bounced off each other, became stronger and stronger. This is not just the Jewish resistance. This is the way we win. This is what Jews do. One hope is dashed. We build a new hope. We build a new future, and we live by it. We live by our faith. We don't just allow our faith to be passive. Our faith becomes active and activated by the negative situations that we're in. And in those moments of suffering, we don't just find meaning, we find purpose. We don't just find purpose, we find hope. In those moments of pain, we say, you will never be able to make me suffer. You will never control me. I will live every single day continuing to fulfill my mission, to live as a Jew, and to bring about the ultimate coming of Mashiach, may be speedily in our days. Amen. With this, we'll conclude lesson 4, which has been Out of the Depths, I Call to You. I look forward to seeing you all next week for lesson 5, which is titled A Tree of Life.
Thank you.